Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the most exhausting childhood you never had. Imagine being born into a world where teething wasn't your biggest problem, starvation, predators, and fire accidents were. Childhood wasn't a playground. It was an unpaid internship in survival. From infants buried with beads and fox teeth, as if their deaths were a group project in symbolism. 2 toddlers gnawing on marrow bones because porridge hadn't been invented yet. 2 kids running toward mammoth traps while hoping they weren't the accidental bait. Prehistoric childhood was short, brutal, and very, very creative in ways to kill you. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this strange corner of history where we remind you that the past was not a soft place. And I'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? I imagine some of you are curled up at midnight, while others are listening with daylight still dripping in through the window. Now, set the mood. Dim the lights, let a fan hum in the background, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket. We're about to slip into the smoke of ancient fires, into a childhood that ended before it began. Let's begin. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget the soft hospital sheets, the pastel onesie, the overpaid photographer taking pictures of your new pink toes. Instead, imagine sliding into existence on a floor of dirt, ash, and animal hair, with no epidural in sight, and a soundtrack of crackling firewood, and someone in the corner trying to keep hyenas from circling too close. Congratulations, you've just been born into the Stone Age, where life expectancy was so low it's almost offensive to call it an expectancy. You weren't a miracle, you were a coin toss. Half of all prehistoric children didn't survive past age 5. The numbers don't lie. Your odds of making it to toddlerhood made roulette look generous. Forget balloons and flowers. Your birth announcement was more like, "We'll see if this one sticks." The real star of the show wasn't you anyway, it was your mother. Childbirth in the prehistoric world was a dangerous gamble that often ended in both mother and infant not making it. There were no midwives trained in obstetrics, no clean sheets, no antiseptic tools. There was just instinct, pain, and maybe, if you were lucky, an older woman who had managed to survive the same ordeal enough times to know what not to do. Even then, complications like obstructed labor or hemorrhage had only one outcome, and it wasn't a baby shower. And if you think your dramatic entrance into the world would be celebrated, think again. There were no official records, no little plaster footprints stamped into a card. You were wrapped in animal skins, or plant fibers, if those were around, and then everyone quietly went back to tending the fire, because there were still berries to gather and predators to scare off. Life didn't pause for your grand arrival. Of course, the natural environment didn't care about your fragile little lungs either. Cold, too bad, no heating. Infection, hope your immune system improvises. Malnutrition, well, it's a long season until the herd migrates back. If your mother's milk wasn't rich enough, or if she herself was starving, then you might not even see your first moon cycle. Babies in the Paleolithic weren't cushioned by formula or backup fridges of frozen breast milk. They were tied directly to the rise and fall of the hunt. If the hunt failed, you failed. But the danger wasn't only starvation. Prehistoric camps weren't sterile little nurseries. They were chaotic ecosystems. Fires that could scorch, stone tools sharp enough to slice arteries, bones scattered on the ground ready to stab tender skin. And don't forget the ever-present threat of predators. Archaeologists have found remains of children with bite marks from wolves and hyenas. Nature's not subtle about the food chain. If you were tiny and helpless, you weren't at the top of it. And yet, somehow, enough of you survived. Which is why we're here talking about it at all. The secret was the group. Babies weren't private property. They were everyone's problem. Older siblings carried them. Aunts and grandmothers nursed them when mothers couldn't. Men protected them in the chaos of a hunt. Cooperation was the only reason prehistoric childhood existed at all. Without it, humanity would have just been a failed experiment in walking upright and complaining. So yes, your first breath as a prehistoric child wasn't the beginning of a cozy childhood. It was the starting whistle in a race against death, malnutrition, wild animals, and the cosmic indifference of nature. And if you somehow squeaked past those first terrifying years, well, then things really started to get interesting. So, let's say you survived the coin toss of birth. Congrats, you've already beaten the odds, though you don't get a medal for that, just a few more years of hunger, diarrhea, and everyone hoping you don't keel over before you can carry a basket of roots. Childhood in prehistory wasn't about running carefree through meadows. It was about hanging on like a stubborn weed in a storm. Your lifeline was your mother's milk, and you were going to be attached to her for a very long time. Forget the 6 months your modern doctor recommends prehistoric kids nursed for years. 3, sometimes 4, depending on how much food the group had and whether another baby was on the way. Breast milk wasn't just a snack. It was a survival kit, packed with calories, antibodies, and just enough comfort to keep you from crying too loudly and attracting wolves. Weaning was less about some gentle, organic porridge and more about chewing half-mashed tubers or gnawing at scraps of half-cooked meat someone decided you were ready for. But let's not romanticize this. Your little body was constantly under siege. Archaeologists can tell from prehistoric skeletons that children's bones often show lines of stunted growth, like tree rings announcing every famine and fever. Anemia was common, caused by iron-poor diets and parasites. Dental enamel, flaked and pitted, proof of malnutrition or fevers. Basically, your teeth were the medical record nobody asked for. An illness was everywhere. Without clean water, every sip carried the risk of parasites. Without sanitation, every handful of dirt contained bacteria waiting for your still-forming immune system. Diarrhea wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a leading cause of death. A stomach bug could kill you faster than a lion. And if you managed to dodge disease, there were still accidents. Crawling too close to the fire, choking on a piece of bone, or falling into a river your tiny arms couldn't fight. You also didn't have the luxury of being coddled. Prehistoric groups couldn't afford dead weight, even if that dead weight had dimples and a cute laugh. If you were weak or sickly, you might simply not be carried along when the camp moved. It sounds brutal, and it was, but mobility and survival came before sentiment. And the evidence is there. Some child burials show careful adornment, beads, ochre, and tenderness, while others look rushed, shallow, and forgotten. Yet in those early years, survival wasn't just biology, it was social. The alloparenting system, mother women nursing you, siblings carrying you, grandmothers feeding you, was the secret glue of human survival. It's why humans could live in so many harsh environments. A prehistoric baby wasn't raised by 2 doting parents. It was raised by a collective of whoever was available and still breathing. Without that, you'd have been saber-toothed chow by your first birthday. Still, even with help, nothing was guaranteed. Your tiny body was like a canvas where every hardship was painted in bone and scar. Survival wasn't a childhood right. It was a constant negotiation with hunger, infection, and gravity. And if you thought things might get easier once you could walk, think again. Walking just meant you could start working and start risking death in even more creative ways. By now you're upright, wobbling around on legs too thin for the oversized head evolution stuck you with. Congratulations, you're mobile, which only means one thing. Now you're also mobile and hungry. And hunger, in prehistory, wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was your default setting. Food was never guaranteed. The modern idea of a full pantry would have been prehistoric witchcraft. One week you might have a belly full of mammoth marrow, and the next you'd be licking charred grasshoppers off a stone, because that's literally all there was. For a child, this meant perpetual uncertainty. You ate when adults ate, and adults ate when the land or the hunt allowed. No snacks tucked into lunchboxes, no warm soup waiting at home. If the hunt failed, so did your stomach. And what exactly was on the menu? Mostly plants, roots, tubers, berries, seedsies for small hands to gather, hard for small stomachs to digest. A lot of what you ate was fibrous, gritty, and laced with dirt. Archaeologists know this because prehistoric teeth are worn down like sandpaper from chewing on plants filled with grit and silica. Imagine losing your baby teeth, not because they fell out naturally, but because you ground them down like old millstones. Meat was precious, yes, but rare. Large kills were occasional windfalls, not regular dinners. And as a child, you were usually stuck with scraps, marrow cracked from bones, organs tossed to the side, the stringy bits nobody else wanted. Protein kept you alive, but you didn't exactly dine like a king. In fact, isotopic studies of prehistoric skeletons suggest children often had lower protein diets than adults, because adults ate first. If there was one fat haunch, guess who didn't get it? Hint, it wasn't the guy holding the spear. And starvation wasn't just about the gnawing pain in your gut, it marked your body forever. Skeletal remains of prehistoric children show telltale signs of malnutrition, rickets from vitamin D deficiency, anemia from iron-poor diets, and enamel hyperplasia lines and pits on teeth showing every famine and stress event you endured. Your bones literally carried the scars of every missed meal. You might think gathering plants was a safer bet, but even that came with its own fun risks. Pick the wrong berry, chew the wrong root, and congratulations, you've just ingested prehistoric poison. Some archaeological sites show traces of children who likely died from toxic plants, mistaken for edible ones. Trial and error was the education system, and children were the volunteers. And then there were the long stretches of lean seasons, winter in Europe, dry spells in Africa, storms that scattered herds times when your community's survival strategy was simply eat whatever doesn't kill you immediately. That could mean bark, insects, or, in the bleakest cases, marrow cracked out of old human bones. Yes, evidence of cannibalism exists in several Paleolithic sites, and no, they weren't doing it for fun. Hunger makes philosophers of no one. So you grew up with hunger not as an occasional complaint, but as a permanent companion. It sharpened you, weakened you, carved itself into your ribs and your patience. You learned quickly that life wasn't about fullness but about avoiding emptiness. And if you thought your scrawny arms and rumbling stomach were tough now, just wait until the environment joined in, because hunger was only one half of the problem. The other was that everything out there wanted to kill you. So, you're hungry. Yes, but don't worry. Nature had plenty of ways to distract you from your stomach by trying to kill you outright. The prehistoric environment wasn't a gentle backdrop. It was more like a rigged game show where every contestant either froze, burned, drowned, or got eaten before the credits rolled. Let's start with housing, or rather, the lack of it. Forget walls, windows, or a roof that didn't leak. Your home was wherever the group happened to camp that week. A cave if you were lucky, a windbreak of mammoth bones if you were clever, or just the open air if nothing else was around. And let's be honest, caves sound cozy now, but in reality they were damp, smoky, crowded, and often already occupied by something with claws. You shared your bedroom with bats, bears, or hyenas who hadn't signed any rental agreements. Temperature was another relentless enemy. Prehistoric children grew up during periods like the Ice Age, when winter wasn't some frosty postcard, it was months of brutal cold, with no insulation except whatever animal skins your parents could scrape together. Hypothermia wasn't a rare event. It was the background hum of daily life. Archaeological evidence shows groups huddled around fires almost constantly, and you can bet a curious child got too close more than once. Burn scars on ancient bones tell the story. Playtime near the flames often ended in charred skin, and if you managed to avoid freezing or burning, you could always count on drowning. Rivers were lifelines, water, fish, game animals nearby, but there were also traps. Children fetched water, played near the banks, and occasionally slipped into currents, stronger than their skinny arms could fight. Excavations show small skeletons buried close to riverbeds, suggesting water claimed more than a few lives. Then there were the predators. Remember, you were not the apex predator. Not even close. Lions, wolves, cave bears, leopards, saber-toothed, Quetzal, of them viewed a small child as an easy snack. Fossil evidence even shows bite marks on children's bones. If you strayed too far from the group, you weren't just lost, you were dinner. Nighttime wasn't peaceful either. You slept lightly, because out in the dark something was always sniffing closer. The fire wasn't just warmth. It was the thin, flickering line between your ribcage and a hyena's stomach. And let's not forget the terrain itself. Prehistoric landscapes weren't paved for convenience. They were jagged, uneven, and full of hidden hazards. Falls, twisted ankles, smashed skulls, all very common. Skeletons of children show fractures from falls that sometimes healed but often didn't. Mobility was everything, and if you lost it, you didn't just limp, you slowed the group. And slowing the group meant becoming a liability. And liabilities, in harsh environments, rarely got second chances. Diseases thrived in these conditions, too. Cold, wet caves fostered respiratory infections. Cuts turned septic in dirty camps. Parasites lived in untreated water and raw meat. Every cough could spiral into pneumonia. Every scratch could be your last. No antibiotics, no ointments, no gentle spoonful of honey tea. Just hope you don't die before sunrise. So childhood wasn't a golden age, was a gauntlet. You grew up under a sky that didn't care if you froze, a ground that tripped you at every turn, rivers that dragged you under, and predators that saw you as a snack-sized portion. And if you thought surviving the elements was enough to earn a rest, think again. Because sometimes the danger wasn't outside, it was crawling around inside your own body. If the cold didn't finish you, the fire didn't burn you, and the hyenas didn't chew your bones, don't get too confident. There was another assassin waiting for prehistoric children, and it didn't growl or chase you, it just slipped in quietly with every sip of water, every bite of food, every scratch that never healed. Disease was your most loyal childhood companion. Let's start with the stomach, because that's where misery usually began. Without clean water or any concept of hygiene, every drink was a lottery ticket in the parasite raffle. Worms, amoebas, bacteria. Your gut was less a digestive system and more an overcrowded diarrhea wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a death sentence for children. It drained your tiny body of water and salts faster than the adults could replace them. And since rehydration therapy wasn't invented for another 20,000 years or so, you simply wasted away. Archaeologists can see this in the skeletal record. Tiny bones showing signs of chronic malnutrition, their growth stunted by endless bouts of sickness. And then there were the infections. A cut from a sharp stone, a scrape on the knee, a bite from an insect hit, all had the potential to end you. Without antibiotics, infections spread fast, rotting flesh and poisoning blood. Skulls from prehistoric burials show abscesses in teeth holes of rot that would have throbbed with agony and spread bacteria straight into the bloodstream. Imagine being 6 years old and dying from a toothache. That was reality. Respiratory diseases loved caves. They were damp, smoky from constant fires, and crowded with bodies. Evidence suggests tuberculosis already haunted humans tens of thousands of years ago. Lungs weakened, chests collapsed, and children were the easiest victims. If you didn't suffocate in the dark, you coughed yourself weak enough to be taken by the next passing flu. Rickets and scurvy made their appearances too. Rickets twisted bones due to lack of vitamin D. Scurvy rotted gums from vitamin C deficiency. Both are visible in prehistoric child skeletons: bent legs, fragile spines, jaws marked by poor nutrition. Childhood wasn't just fragile. It was deformed by the constant negotiation with scarcity. And then there were the fevers, the unnamed plagues. Archaeologists can't always pin down what caused them, but mass child burials in some sites suggest waves of disease swept through groups, leaving rows of tiny skeletons behind. No explanation, no cure, no priests or doctors to blame, just invisible death moving from body to body until it ran out of hosts. The irony is, the things that kept you alive often made you sick. Eating raw meat, parasites, drinking milk past infancy. Not an option, you couldn't digest it yet. Living in close-knit groups for safety, perfect for spreading disease. You were safest when isolated, but isolation killed you faster. Choose your poison literally, and don't think you could complain about all this. A whining child just made more noise, and noise meant predators or rival groups could find you. So you suffered in silence, clutching your stomach, burning with fever, or coughing until your ribs ached, while adults muttered practical things like, "Maybe the gods are angry, or we'll see if she makes it." There were no cures, no rituals that worked, no medicines beyond chewing bitter plants that sometimes helped and sometimes killed you quicker. So if hunger was the constant drumbeat of your early life, disease was the shrill flute that played over it, a reminder that your body was never entirely yours. Just a battlefield where microbes, parasites, and your immune system wrestled endlessly. And if you managed, somehow, not to collapse under that invisible war, then it was time to learn something new, how to actually be useful. Because in prehistory, surviving wasn't enough. You had to start earning your keep before you could even pronounce half the words for food. So, let's say you've staggered past the disease years, thinner, scarred, and probably missing a few baby teeth before their time. Congratulations, you're still alive. That means the group now expects you to stop being a fragile parasite and start being vaguely useful. Childhood, in prehistory, wasn't an extended holiday of playdates and finger painting. It was a crash course in not dying, taught without teachers, lesson plans, or the faintest concern for child safety. Your classroom, the campfire, the hunt, the gathering trip, your instructors, Everyone older than you, who expected you to learn by watching, not by asking. Prehistoric societies didn't sit children down with lectures. They didn't have the time. Knowledge was passed along by demonstration and imitation. You didn't learn how to use a tool by being told. You learned by picking up a sharp flake of stone and cutting your finger open, after which you learned very quickly to hold it the other way around. And tools weren't toys. A poorly aimed swing of a hand axe could slice deep enough to cripple you. But you had to start early because survival didn't wait for adolescence. Archaeological evidence suggests children as young as 4 or 5 already practiced with small versions of tools, little scrapers, flakes, or even mini bows. Were they training aids? Possibly. Or maybe adults just handed kids whatever was lying around. Either way, practice meant bleeding on occasion. You also learned how to process food, and that meant fire. Fire was warmth, safety, and dinner, but also burns, smoke, inhalation, and ash in your eyes. Children spent hours near it, roasting roots, drying meat, watching sparks fly. Many didn't just watch, they toppled in. Healed burned scars have been found on prehistoric bones, which means fire wasn't a cozy hearth. It was a hot teacher, and it gave lessons quickly, but it wasn't all immediate danger. Some tasks were smaller, softer. You practiced gathering, identifying berries, digging tubers, cracking nuts. You were expected to know which plants killed you and which filled you, and the only way to figure that out was by trial, error, and sometimes funerals. Mistakes were memorable, deadly memorable. So you studied intently, copying your mother, your aunt, your grandmother, until you could tell safe routes from poisonous lookalikes. Language helped, of course. By this time in human evolution, communication was sophisticated enough to warn children about dangers. Words, gestures, stories all formed part of your survival education. A tale told by the fire wasn't just entertainment, it was a coded manual for life. Don't walk into the river at night. Don't touch that plant. Don't trust the cave when the bear's at home. You didn't get fairy tales, you got practical horror stories. Play, too, was part of learning. Children wrestled, threw stones, stalked each other like hunters. It wasn't frivolous. Play honed the muscles, sharpened reflexes, and tested courage. Anthropologists studying modern foraging groups see the same pattern. What looks like fun is actually training. You learned balance, carrying heavy loads, precision by throwing sticks, and cooperation by joining group games that mirrored hunts. But let's not pretend you got a choice. This wasn't an extracurricular activity. This was unpaid apprenticeship in the full-time business of staying alive. And while modern parents buy toy kitchens to teach responsibility, you were given a flint blade and expected not to sever a finger. The stakes were a little higher, so your childhood wasn't a bubble of innocence. It was an initiation stretched over years. Every cut, bruise, and scar was a lesson. And if you thought you were just going to play all day, think again. Play itself was training, sharpening you for what came next. Work, because by the time you could carry a basket without tripping, the group was already eyeing you as a future laborer in the great unpaid corporation of survival. You might think play was the one part of prehistoric childhood that was safe, fun, and innocent. Not quite. Play was your internship. Every game, every laugh, every stone you threw at your friend's head was secretly boot camp for the business of not dying. Childhood play wasn't separate from survival. Was survival rehearsed with slightly less blood? Take throwing games. You and the other kids hurled sticks, stones, bones, anything that flew. From the outside, it might have looked like aimless chaos. In reality, you were sharpening your hand-eye. Coordination for the day someone handed you a spear and pointed you toward a very confused antelope. Archaeologists have even found miniature spears and bows, scaled down to child size, which suggests children practiced with toys that could definitely kill something small, and possibly each other. Your first bullseye might not have been a mammoth, but a lizard, unlucky enough to wander into range. Then there were chasing games, tag hide-and-seek, racing through the scrub. These weren't idle distractions. They trained your endurance, your spatial awareness, your ability to work as a team or to vanish when needed. Imagine sprinting through uneven ground while dodging thorn bushes, with older kids screaming like wild animals behind you. That was fun. It just so happened to also prepare you for running away from predators, rival groups, or an angry adult who caught you stealing marrow. Girls' play wasn't cushioned either. Studies of modern forager societies suggest girls practiced gathering tasks through imitation games, digging, carrying, sorting, that pretend digging for roots with a stick. It was rehearsal for the day you had to provide half the camp's calories. Even play with Dalsius. There are prehistoric figurines, small enough to have been toys, probably wasn't about cuteness. They were practice for childcare, training your little arms to carry and comfort a future sibling when the real thing came along. Your games taught responsibility in the most literal sense. Don't drop the baby. And let's not forget social games. Laughing, teasing, testing boundaries, all of it was practice for navigating the politics of group life. Prehistoric groups were small, but they were still political. Who played fair? Who cheated? Who shared their finds? These behaviors shaped reputations that lasted into adulthood. Your playmates weren't just friends. They were your future hunting partners, co-parents, or rivals. Mess up the social dynamics at age 7, and you might pay for it at age 20, when nobody warns you the lion's behind you. But here's the twist. Prehistoric play wasn't really safe. Those stone toys cut, those bows pierced, those fires for pretend cooking burned. Archaeological finds of child skeletons often show broken bones that healed crooked, the marks of accidents during rough play or clumsy training. Childhood scars weren't a side effect. They were part of the syllabus. Even the rhythm of your day blurred play into labor. You fetched small sticks while pretending to help. You dug for bugs while competing with other kids. You practiced making sounds with flutes carved from bird bones, objects found in Paleolithic sites that might have been toys or training for ritual. Nothing was ever just play. It was always rehearsal for adulthood, camouflaged in laughter, covered in bruises. So when we picture prehistoric children playing, don't imagine carefree innocence under the sun. Picture a half-dozen grubby kids hurling sharp rocks at each other, tripping over roots, imitating hunts, and occasionally catching fire-roll while giggling. It looked like play. It was really a crash course in becoming functional humans before your first molars finished erupting. And once you'd proven that play could translate into skill, there was no escape from the next stage. Actual work. Real, daily, backbreaking work, with no game to hide it. If you thought play was tough, wait until the adults decided you'd graduated from small, annoying trainee to tiny laborer with no union. Childhood in prehistory ended the moment you could reliably carry something without falling flat on your face. By around 5 or 6 years old, you weren't playing at survival anymore. You were drafted into it. Your first assignments were small, but not optional. Gathering was the big one. Adults needed calories, and you were free labor with short legs and nimble hands. So you were sent digging for tubers, picking berries, stripping bark, or collecting edible bugs. It sounds easy until you remember that berry picking also meant try not to grab the poisonous ones that look almost identical. Archaeological studies of forager groups suggest children contributed meaningful amounts of food, sometimes up to half of daily plant calories, long before they were teenagers. And then there was carrying. Water from the stream, wood for the fire, baskets of nuts all loaded onto you because you were young, expendable, and less likely to argue than an adult. Child skeletons from prehistoric sites often show stress markers in their spines and joints, meaning those little bodies were hauling loads heavy enough to reshape bone. Forget playground monkey bars. Your workout plan was carry sticks until your back hurts. Sometimes the work was dangerous, scaring animals toward traps. For example, adults would build pits or set snares, and children were the runners, shouting and waving to drive small game in the right direction. It was effective, but it also meant you were sprinting around while terrified animals bolted in all directions. One wrong turn and you could be trampled by the very dinner you were trying to catch. You might also be expected to tend fires, keeping embers alive while the group ranged out hunting. A noble responsibility, but imagine being 7 years old, with the survival of your camp literally glowing in front of you. If it went out, everyone came home cold and furious, and you probably got a lecture in the form of no dinner. Work wasn't only physical though. You were absorbing knowledge constantly. How to chip stone without shattering it. How to recognize tracks in the dirt. How to tell from a bird's call whether danger was close. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer kids note that by age 8, most know the basics of foraging and can navigate the landscape with confidence. That was your real school, the land itself, with failure marked in bruises or hunger, not bad report cards. And let's not forget the delightful possibility of injury. Stone flakes cut small fingers, wood splinters festered, and lifting heavy loads caused breaks. Evidence of healed fractures in child bones shows they didn't escape unscathed. Some healed crooked, meaning you carried your limp or twisted arm into adulthood as a reminder of one poorly executed chore. But complaining wasn't an option. Prehistoric groups couldn't afford to waste energy on whiners. If you were strong enough to walk, you were strong enough to help. Childhood was short, brutally short, and every mouth had to justify itself. You weren't seen as fragile. You were an apprentice adult, expected to add to the collective or risk being labeled a burden. So by the time modern kids are still figuring out how to tie their shoelaces, you were already hauling firewood, foraging in dangerous terrain, and trying not to get stomped by wildlife. And this was just the prelude, because sooner or later, someone was going to hand you a weapon and tell you to stop practicing on lizards and start aiming at things with hooves. By the time your arms were strong enough to lift more than a stick, someone decided it was time to put something sharper in them. Childhood in prehistory wasn't about waiting until you were ready. Readiness was a luxury. If you could walk, carry, and not stab yourself immediately, you were handed weapons scaled down. Yes, but still lethal. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Miniature bows, small spears, and child-sized projectiles have been found at sites across the world. These weren't toys, they were training wheels for killing. Your first practice shots might have been at tree trunks, lizards, or unfortunate birds. And yes, you probably missed a lot. Archaeologists also find piles of broken, misfired projectiles scattered around. But failure was expected. What mattered was drilling those reflexes until you could one day bring home something bigger than a frog. Of course, practice wasn't safe. A badly thrown spear could ricochet, a taut bowstring could whip your face, and a misstep with a stone axe could open your leg like a butcher's cut. Evidence of deep gashes and fractures on juvenile bones suggests many kids didn't make it out of weapons training intact. But pain was part of the curriculum. The sooner you learned the cost of a mistake, the better chance you had later against prey that fought back. And let's talk about the prey. You weren't hunting plush toys. You were learning to bring down animals that could gore, trample, or bite you to pieces. Deer and boar were dangerous enough, but larger game, bison, aurochs, mammoths were basically walking death traps. Children usually weren't sent to the front lines, but they were part of the process, driving animals into traps, carrying weapons, watching the older hunters. Observational learning was everything. The first time you saw a spear sink into fur, you knew what adulthood looked like, and it wasn't pretty. Your education also included strategy. How to move silently, how to read tracks in mud, how to recognize the difference between that's a rabbit and that's a wolf pretending to be a rabbit by walking away suspiciously slowly. Modern hunter-gatherer children picked this up early, and prehistoric ones did too. Your eyes were trained to notice every snapped twig, every shift in bird calls, every trail of dung. But hunting wasn't just about food, it was prestige. Hunters held status, and training children early wasn't just practical, it was political. Being able to hit a target meant you were on your way to proving yourself useful to the group. Missed too often, and you weren't just a bad shot, you were a liability, another hungry mouth not earning its keep. Childhood didn't spare you from reputation. Everyone noticed whether your stone hit or missed. And don't imagine this was some solitary apprenticeship. Hunting was social theater. Older kids competed constantly, showing off accuracy, mocking each other's failures, boasting about whose arrow flew straightest. This wasn't schoolyard rivalry, it was survival-coded bravado, with the underlying message that only the competent would eat well in the years to come. So by the time modern children are learning multiplication tables, you are learning how to pull back a bowstring, how to calculate the distance of prey, and how to steady your hands when an animal bigger than you thundered past. And the brutal truth, you never really got to stop. Once you'd proven you could handle a weapon, you were folded into the endless cycle of hunting. And even if you survived the animals, the next challenge was less predictable, more insidious. Other humans, watching you grow, calculating where you fit in the fragile balance of the group. By now you've got calloused hands, a collection of scars, and maybe the faintest hint of confidence with a spear. You'd think survival skills alone would be enough to secure your place. But no, prehistoric life wasn't just about killing deer and not falling in the fire. It was about knowing your rank in the group. Because in a world where every day was survival triage, social hierarchy was as real as hunger. Prehistoric groups were small, maybe 20, 30, sometimes 50 people, cozy enough that everyone knew each other's business, but crowded enough that tension simmered constantly. And as a child, you were already being slotted into the pecking order. Age mattered, of course. The older kids bossed you around because they could. But contribution mattered more. If you could haul a basket of tubers, if you could track a rabbit, if you could make yourself useful, you earned a little respect. If not, well, you were just another noisy liability. Weakness was rarely tolerated. Evidence from some burial sites suggests disabled children were sometimes cared for, which is beautiful in its way. But in lean times, groups couldn't always carry everyone. Survival meant hard choices, and children who couldn't keep up sometimes didn't make it. It sounds brutal to modern ears, but prehistoric reality wasn't sentimental. The line between beloved and burdensome was razor thin, and it wasn't just strength. Bloodlines counted. Some children were born into higher status simply because of who their parents were. Archaeologists point to lavish child burials, tiny skeletons adorned with beads, shells, ivory carvings, ochre. These weren't just funerals, they were announcements. This child mattered more. Meanwhile, other kids were buried in shallow, plain pits, suggesting their lives were valued differently. Inequality existed before kingdoms, and you felt it even before you could speak. You also had to learn the politics of attention. Share food with the wrong child, and suddenly their family owed you. Ignore someone, and you created a grievance. Games weren't innocent anymore. They were trial runs for adult alliances. Anthropologists studying modern foragers see children practicing gift-giving, cooperation, even manipulation. Yes, manipulation long before puberty. You weren't just learning to throw a spear. You were learning how not to get stabbed in the back, socially or literally. And let's not overlook gender. Boys and girls weren't trained identically. In most prehistoric groups, boys were pushed toward hunting and defense, girls toward gathering and childcare. But that didn't mean girls had it easier. Gathering provided most of the calories, and childcare was constant. You were trained from early on to step into roles that carried weight for the whole group. And if you thought gender equality was invented with smartphones, think again. Sometimes girls were honored hunters, sometimes boys gathered plants, depending on the needs of the group. Pragmatism trumped ideology, but the pressure never went away. Hierarchy was reinforced in rituals too. You weren't just told you were lower ranked, you were shown. Maybe you sat further from the fire, ate last, or got the smallest portion of meat. Archaeological finds of differential food remains in campsites suggest that not everyone got equal servings. Being a child meant smaller bones and smaller rations, whether you liked it or not. So your childhood wasn't just survival training. It was constant rehearsal for where you'd stand in the invisible but very real ladder of your group. Every bite you ate, every chore you performed, every laugh you gave in the wrong direction could tilt the scales of how others saw you. And just when you thought you had figured out the human politics, you remembered something. The humans weren't the only predators sizing you up. Out there in the dark, with glowing eyes and teeth, waited the competition that didn't care about your rank at all. So you've clawed your way into a fragile place in the group hierarchy. Maybe you're useful enough not to be ignored. Maybe you've earned a bigger scrap of marrow. But don't get comfortable. Because out there, beyond the firelight, were the true arbiters of your childhood. Predators, and they didn't care if you were the chief's son, or the best berry picker, or just a skinny little kid trying to stay alive. To them, you were a snack-sized portion of protein wrapped in fragile skin. The list of suspects was long. Cave lions, cave hyenas, leopards, wolves, bears, and, if you were really unlucky, the saber-toothed cat, with teeth like daggers that didn't care about your family's survival strategies. Archaeologists have found prehistoric child remains with puncture marks that line up neatly with predator teeth. You weren't just living near predators, you were on their menu, and children were perfect targets. You were slower, weaker, noisier. You wandered away from camp because curiosity is hardwired, and that's how you ended up as a hyena's midnight snack. Parents and adults did what they could, keeping fires burning, posting lookouts, but even then, danger lurked. A child on the edges of camp was basically ringing a dinner bell. Caves, those so-called shelters, were double-edged swords. Yes, they kept you out of the rain, but they were also prime real estate for predators. More than one archaeological site shows evidence of humans and carnivores alternating occupancy. Imagine settling in for the night. only to realize the scratches on the walls weren't made by your artistic uncle, but by the last bear who claimed the place. You slept lightly because you had to. Darkness was not your friend. Daytime wasn't safer. Rivers and waterholes, essential for life, were also ambush points. Big cats and crocodiles knew the routine. You came to drink. They came to kill. A child fetching water wasn't just doing a chore. They were performing a balancing act between thirst and death. Anthropological parallels with modern foragers show kids often fetch water in groups, precisely because safety came in numbers, and predators weren't the only killers. Birds of prey, massive eagles in particular, have left talon marks on small hominin skulls from earlier periods. That's right, if you were small enough, you didn't just look like food to things on the ground, but also to the sky. Childhood wasn't just spent looking down at roots, it was spent looking up to see if claws were descending. So what protected you? Fire, mostly. That glowing circle was more than warmth, it was a psychological and physical shield. Predators feared it, which is why children were often tasked with feeding it. But fire didn't solve everything. If it went out, panic spread quickly, and you, the child, often stood at the very edge of its light, where shadows blurred into hunting ground. You weren't just playing, you were bait, whether anyone admitted it or not. And then, of course, there was the simple fact that sometimes predators won. Groups moved often, sometimes not just for food, but because too many children or too many adults had been dragged off. Survival wasn't just a battle against hunger or cold. It was a permanent arms race against teeth, claws, and patience honed by millions of years of evolution. So when you lay down at night, belly half empty, smoke in your eyes, head on a bed of grass and hides, you didn't dream of toys or comfort. You listened for the snap of twigs, the growl in the dark, and hoped you weren't next. And if you thought predators were bad, well, at least they killed quickly. The real lingering misery came from accidents, the slow betrayals of gravity, fire, and your own fragile body. Predators were dramatic, yes, teeth, claws, glowing eyes in the dark. But honestly, the more common enemy of a prehistoric child was gravity, and fire, and sharp rocks, and your own clumsy little body. If predators were the headline deaths, accidents were the fine print, quiet, constant, and just as lethal. Start with falls. Prehistoric landscapes weren't playgrounds, they were obstacle courses designed by a sadistic architect. Uneven rocks, hidden holes, slippery riverbanks. Children ran, climbed, scrambled, and inevitably fell. Archaeologists have uncovered plenty of juvenile skeletons with broken arms, fractured skulls, twisted spines. Some healed, some didn't. Imagine tripping on a root while gathering berries, cracking your head open, and game over. No helmets, no stitches, no consoling nurse with a lollipop. And even if you survived a fall, healing wasn't guaranteed. A broken bone today is a temporary inconvenience. Back then, it was a possible death sentence. Immobilization meant you slowed the group. Infection could creep in. Healed fractures found on bones often show crooked alignments, meaning you walked into adulthood limping, stooping, or dragging an arm that never quite worked again. You weren't recovered, you were permanently marked. Then there were burns. Fire was the great friend, the center of camp life, but it was also merciless. Children spent hours near flames, poking, stoking, pretending to cook, which means they also toppled in, brushed against embers, or stepped barefoot on coals. Archaeological evidence of burn marks on bones tells the story. Play and chores blurred into danger. And burns weren't just painful, they were infections waiting to happen. Without ointments or clean dressings, a burn could fester into a death sentence. Sharp tools added their own hazards. Stone blades cut flesh as easily as they cut hides. A distracted child flaking stone could slice a finger to the bone. Hand axes were heavy, clumsy, and unforgiving. The archaeological record is filled with accidental injuries from tool use. And children, learning by imitation, were the most frequent victims of their own enthusiasm. Water was no safer. Rivers and lakes, crucial for survival, were accidents waiting to happen. Children fetching water could slip, be swept away by currents, or drown in silence while the camp was busy elsewhere. In some regions, skeletal remains of children are disproportionately found near riverbeds, mute evidence of how often water became a grave. Even eating could kill you. Bones lodged in throats, food poisoning from spoiled meat, choking on fibrous plants. Death didn't always come from lions, it came from dinner. Tooth abscesses, visible in prehistoric skulls, also tell us that dental pain often spiraled into lethal infections. Imagine being 12, with no dentist, and an infection creeping from your jaw into your bloodstream. Childhood ended fast. But the thing about accidents is that you didn't stop to grieve them for long. Prehistoric life didn't allow downtime. A child broke a leg. The group might carry them if they were valuable or leave them if they weren't. A burn became infected. Too bad. The pace of survival didn't slow. Children were mourned, yes, but quickly, because everyone else still had to move, hunt, and eat. So childhood wasn't just about fearing predators or hunger. It was about knowing that any wrong step, any bad fall, any unlucky scrape could flip the switch from alive to dead. And if you managed to dodge accidents long enough to stumble toward adolescence, you weren't safe. You were about to become entangled in something stranger, heavier, and sometimes sacred, ritual, where even children were pulled into the symbolic theater of life and death. If you've managed to dodge predators, starvation, disease, and the clumsiness of your own legs, you'd think the universe might finally give you a break. But no. Prehistoric childhood came with another layer, ritual. Because even if you were small, fragile, and not particularly useful yet, your life and, more often your death still carried meaning far bigger than you. Let's start with the burials, because frankly, that's where most of the evidence is. Archaeologists have uncovered child graves from as far back as 30,000 years ago, and some of them are stunning. Take the Sungir children in Russia, 2 kids, about 10 and 12, buried head to head, covered with thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, and carved spears. That wasn't casual. That was a statement. Their short lives were wrapped in ritual, their deaths transformed into social theater. They weren't just children, they were symbols. But don't think every child got that treatment. Many were buried quickly, shallowly, sometimes with nothing at all. Their graves say more about social rank than about childhood itself. Some children mattered ritually, politically, or symbolically, while others were folded into the earth without fanfare. And that inequality wasn't an invention of kingdoms. It was there at the roots of humanity. Still, the very existence of elaborate burials tells us something. Prehistoric groups saw children as more than just mouths to feed. Even young deaths were folded into spiritual systems. Beads, ochre, carvings, animal parts, all buried with children's, suggest beliefs that their lives had cosmic weight, even if short. Childhood mortality was so common that it had to be explained, woven into myth, turned into something less unbearable. Some rituals touched the living. Children weren't just passive recipients of adult beliefs, they participated. Anthropologists studying modern foragers note that children take part in initiation rehearsals, dances, or small symbolic acts. Prehistoric kids likely did the same. Maybe they wore beads, painted themselves with ochre, or joined group ceremonies where the line between play and sacred blurred. Those bird bone flutes found in Paleolithic sites, they might have been toys, but they might also have been training tools for ritual soundscapes. Imagine being 10, squeaking out a melody not for fun, but as practice for invoking the spirits. And then there's the darker possibility, sacrifice. Evidence is sparse, but in some later prehistoric societies, child remains have been found in ritual contexts, suggesting offerings to gods or ancestors. Even if Paleolithic groups weren't doing it widely, the seeds of that logic were already there. Children as potent symbols, bridges between the living and the dead. In a world where survival was so fragile, what could feel more powerful than binding the community through the life or loss of a child? So your childhood wasn't just measured in chores and training, it was also watched, framed, narrated by beliefs you barely understood. If you lived, your body might be painted, decorated, or marked in small rituals. If you died, your bones might become the center of a ceremony that outlived you. Either way, your existence carried weight far beyond your years. And just when you thought you'd survived enough rituals for one lifetime, something else arrived. Puberty. Which, in prehistoric terms, didn't mean awkward high school crushes and acne. It meant your body was officially thrust into the adult world. Fertility, responsibility, and labor doubled. Childhood was over before it even felt like it had started. So, you've survived the graveyard odds of infancy, stumbled through the hunger years, and made it out of childhood without being carried off by a lion. Congratulations. Now comes the most confusing and thankless stage of all, adolescence. And in prehistory, this wasn't about slamming doors, moody poetry, or acne cream. It was the moment your body announced to everyone, you are now an adult tool, whether you like it or not. Puberty didn't arrive gently. Your voice cracked, your bones stretched, and suddenly, all the adults decided you were ready to carry adult responsibilities. For girls, that meant the bluntest transition possible: fertility. The archaeological record, combined with anthropological parallels, suggests girls often began motherhood in their mid-teens. Imagine still learning how to find tubers while also carrying a baby on your hip. There was no gap here. You went straight from childhood play to childbirth in about 5 minutes flat. For boys, the transformation was equally brutal. Your changing body meant you were now expected to hunt in earnest, not just practice. That meant spears that were heavier than you, hours of stalking game, and the very real possibility of dying on your first adult hunt. Adolescent male skeletons from the Paleolithic show stress markers and fractures that scream one thing: training was over. This was the real deal. If you missed your target, you weren't just embarrassed, you endangered the entire group. And of course, the workload doubled. Adolescents were no longer semi-youthful. They were supposed to pull their weight like adults, gathering larger loads, chasing bigger animals, watching over younger siblings, tending fires, all while still half-grown themselves. Child skeletons show signs of repetitive strain. Adolescent ones show even more. By 14, your bones already looked like they'd done a decade of hard labor, because they had. But the real shift was social. Adolescence was when you were slotted into adult roles. Alliances, flirtations, rivalries, they all began here. The girl you'd thrown sticks at last year was suddenly a potential partner. The boy who mocked your bad aim now competed with you for status in hunts, and your every move was scrutinized. Were you strong enough, fertile enough, clever enough? A teenager's life wasn't about exploration. It was about proving yourself useful before someone quietly decided you weren't worth investing in. Rituals marked this transition to many later hunter-gatherer and early farming societies. Adolescents went through initiation rites, scarification, seclusion, painful tests of endurance. While evidence from the deep Paleolithic is sparse, the seeds were there: symbolic markings on bones, ochre-painted bodies, social divisions between children and adults. Puberty wasn't just biology, it was theater. One day you were a child, the next you were paraded, painted, possibly cut or branded, and declared ready to join the ranks of the weary. And let's be clear, adolescence didn't stretch into a decade-long limbo. It was fast. By the time modern teens are worried about driver's licenses, you were already a parent, a hunter, a contributor. The gap between child and adult was measured in months, not years. So yes, you finally staggered out of childhood, bruised, scarred, hungry, but alive. And then you were shoved headfirst into adulthood, with no warning, no grace period, no second chances. Because in prehistory, adolescence wasn't a phase, it was a crossroads. And only those who adapted quickly lived long enough to call themselves grown. Which leads us to the final stage of this brutal gauntlet: adulthood itself, or what passed for it. Since prehistoric life expectancy meant adult could last about as long as your modern high school career, childhood was short, adolescence was shorter, and the finish line loomed sooner than you think. And here we are. You've been born into chaos, clawed your way through hunger, disease, predators, and accidents, stumbled into adolescence with a spear in one hand and responsibility in the other. You'd think the worst was over, but here's the final twist of prehistoric life. Childhood wasn't just short, life itself was short. Average life expectancy in prehistoric groups hovered around 25 to 35 years. That doesn't mean everyone keeled over at 30, but enough did that you couldn't count on getting old. Childhood, by comparison, was a blink. By 12 or 13 you were essentially treated as an adult. By 15 you might already be a parent. By 25 you were experienced, maybe respected, maybe scarred beyond recognition. And by 30 you were old. If you made it past 40, congratulations, you were practically a living fossil, the wise elder of your group, and everyone stared at you like a walking miracle. The brevity of life explains the harshness of childhood. There wasn't time to coddle, or protect, or ease you gently into things. You had to be useful as soon as possible, because the adults who carried the load weren't going to be around forever. Childhood wasn't seen as a protected bubble, it was an apprenticeship with a countdown clock. Every stumble toward adulthood was accelerated because survival demanded it. The archaeological record makes it painfully clear. Children's skeletons dominate prehistoric burial grounds, their tiny bones marked with malnutrition, infections, and trauma. Those who survived into adolescence carry scars of overwork, repetitive strain, and healed fractures. Life carved itself into the body, leaving no illusions about what childhood really was. And yet, within that brutality, there were threads of tenderness. The beads carefully sewn into a child's burial garment, the ochre painted on a tiny skull, the healed fractures that show someone took the time to carry and care for an injured child long enough for them to survive. These flashes remind us that even in a world of scarcity and fear, children weren't just expendable units. They were loved, mourned, and remembered. Short lives, yes, but not meaningless ones. Still, the truth is unavoidable. Your prehistoric childhood ended almost as soon as it began. Innocence wasn't a stage, it was a luxury nobody had time for. Every day was preparation for contribution, and every contribution was the difference between life and death, for the group. If you survived, you became another adult in the endless grind of gathering, hunting, birthing, and fearing. If you didn't, your body became another bead-studded memory in the earth. So no, you wouldn't have survived life as a prehistoric child. Not the hunger gnawing at your belly, not the infections turning your cuts septic, not the predators stalking your every move. And even if, by some miracle, you did, you'd still grow up far too fast, stumble into adulthood half-starved, and die before you could even imagine retirement. Childhood wasn't a chapter, it was the prologue, and the book itself ended far sooner than you'd like. Infancy in the deep past didn't unfold in pastel cribs or padded nurseries. It began in camps that smelled of ash, blood, and animal hides, where survival was a group project and everyone was an unwilling participant. Children arrived not into safety but into movement, because hunter-gatherer life meant packing, walking, and repacking. A newborn wasn't swaddled in silence. It was strapped against a mother's chest or hip as the group trudged across uneven ground, crossing rivers, following herds, and dodging predators. This constant motion was the child's first education. Before words were available, rhythm did the teaching, the sway of the carrier's stride, the thump of feet on soil, the jolts of climbing over stones. Everything pulsed with a cadence that would one day translate into chasing prey. Even strapped into slings of hide or woven fibers, infants were immersed in the choreography of the hunt long before they understood what it meant. Noise was discouraged. Babies that cried too loudly risked more than irritated parents. They risked drawing attention from lions, wolves, or rival groups. Soothing wasn't optional, it was survival. Mothers nursed often, not just to feed but to silence, and infants quickly learned to match their rhythms to the group's need for quiet. It wasn't tenderness alone. It was tactical muffling. There were no permanent walls to buffer against weather. Shelters were temporary. Hide tents, bone frameworks, or shallow caves when fortune allowed. Inside, fires flickered not just for warmth but for defense. Infants grew up with smoke curling into their lungs, the acrid sting settling into their memories before speech arrived. Their world was cramped, restless, and fragile, no single place to call home. Only the shifting perimeter of a fire's light. And always, there was the hunt. Even as newborns, children were present, carried along in slings or left in the care of others at camp. They were part of the cycle. They heard the sounds, the scrape of stone on stone, the murmur of preparation, the sudden hush before departure. Their earliest impressions were not of lullabies but of stone tools striking cores, the deep cough of men clearing throats, the shuffle of feet readying for pursuit. Hunting wasn't explained to them. It was the background music of their infancy. Anthropologists studying modern foraging groups note how infants absorb environmental patterns long before they speak. A baby's eyes follow the movement of hands hafting tools. Their ears fix on the cadence of group calls. Language isn't necessary. The body catalogues everything. In prehistory, this process was amplified. With no walls, no separation of domestic and subsistence life, the child's playpen was the center of production. Danger reinforced the lesson. There was no margin for error when moving with infants in landscapes stalked by predators. The risk of leaving a child behind, even momentarily, could mean death. Carrying babies was essential, and it shaped physiology. Women developed endurance for hauling not only food, but their young. The children, meanwhile, learned by osmosis what vigilance looked like. So from the very first days, the education of the hunt began not in words, not in explanations, but in movement, in silence, in rhythm, and in the tension between firelight and darkness. Childhood didn't begin with once upon a time. It began with bones cracking over flames, the smell of meat cooking, and the weight of a community in motion. And if infancy was an initiation through carrying and observation, the next stage unfolded in the theater of imitation, where children learned that silence itself could teach more than speech ever could. Instruction in prehistoric childhood didn't begin with lessons. It began with staring. The eyes were the first tools, sharper than any flint blade. Children learned by watching adults, copying movements long before their tongues could form words. No one paused mid-hunt to explain how to chip a core or stalk a deer. There was no lecture, no blackboard, only gestures carved into memory by endless repetition. A toddler perched near the fire didn't need explanations to know that striking stone against stone made sparks, or that sparks meant warmth, or that warmth meant safety. They didn't need vocabulary to understand danger when an adult hissed sharply and froze at the sight of movement in the grass. Silence taught faster than speech ever could. Modern hunter-gatherer studies echo this. Children absorb skills through close observation, often with no verbal instruction at all. They tracked the arc of a hand, the twist of a wrist, the way weight shifts in a step. They mimicked these motions clumsily, sometimes dangerously, but that was the point. Mastery wasn't about explanation. It was about muscle memory carved long before language caught up. And so a child learned to cut meat, not by being told slice with the grain, but by slicing and ruining a piece, getting scolded with a grimace, then trying again. They learned to shape stone by hitting it at the wrong angle, sending shards flying, one of which might slice their hand open. Mistakes weren't corrected with words, they were corrected with blood, bruises, and the sharp looks of elders. There was a strange efficiency in this silence. It turned every movement into a lesson. When adults walked, children trailed behind, matching steps. When adults crouched low at the sight of an animal, children crouched to bodies, mirroring before minds understood. Gestures, not grammar, carried the teaching. A tilt of the head, a raised hand, a finger to the lips all served as commands, warnings, and invitations to learn. The body became a book. To throw a stick meant learning the rhythm of arm and shoulder, not the name of throw. To gut a rabbit meant feeling the pull of sinew and tendon, not reciting the word cut. Knowledge lived in joints and tendons, long before it lived in words. Even play was imitation. Small children pretended to stalk each other, creeping through brush with exaggerated seriousness. They hurled stones at imaginary prey, sometimes at each other, which taught lessons faster than any elder could. These games weren't distractions. They were rehearsals, silent drills woven into everyday life. Archaeological finds confirm this embodied learning. Miniature tools, tiny scrapers, child-sized bows have been unearthed at Paleolithic sites. They weren't toys for amusement. They were scaled-down versions of survival, built for little hands to imitate big ones. Children practiced silently, handling the same materials their parents used, preparing for the day when imitation would become expectation. Silence wasn't just necessity, it was safety. Too much noise could draw predators. Too much chatter could scare prey. Learning through observation and mimicry wasn't just practical, it was essential. Children didn't talk their way into skill. They shadowed, they copied, they absorbed. And when imitation became second nature, when every glance and gesture had already been rehearsed in their bodies, the next stage unfolded. Play stopped being mere mimicry and turned into a structured rehearsal where throwing sticks, chasing each other, and stalking shadows blurred into the earliest versions of the hunt. What looked like play around the camp was never just play. The shrieks of laughter, the stick fights, the mock chases across uneven ground, these weren't diversions from survival. They were survival disguised in miniature, rehearsals with bruises instead of funerals. Childhood games were the laboratory where hunting was first tested. Throwing was the favorite. Sticks, stones, bones, anything that could be hurled became a weapon. Children hurled objects at tree trunks, at scurrying lizards, at each other with questionable accuracy. Archaeologists digging in Paleolithic sites often uncover small projectiles, lighter and shorter than adult versions, They weren't decorative curiosities. They were tools for children learning precision before they could be trusted with a full-sized spear. Missing was expected, but so was learning the curve of an arm, the arc of a shoulder, and the satisfying thud when a stone found its mark. Chasing games worked the same way. Tag wasn't idle for net, was practice for sprinting after prey or fleeing from predators. Children dashed over rocky ground, weaved through scrub, tackled each other, then sprang up laughing, only to repeat it again. To an outsider, it looked like chaos. To the group, it was conditioning. Energy poured into muscles, balance refined itself, reflexes sharpened, imitation gave the games a theatrical edge. Children crept along the ground pretending to be hunters stalking prey. They crouched, pounced, and killed imaginary animals with great seriousness, sometimes ending in scuffles when someone refused to play dead. Anthropologists observing modern forager children see the same behaviors. Mock hunts, complete with roles, one the antelope, the other the hunter, and everyone else debating who cheated. The line between play and training was non-existent. Even tools slipped into these games. A child-sized bow wasn't a toy to be abandoned in the grass. It was a lesson disguised as fun. With every awkward release, the body learned tension, release, aim. By the time words like draw or target had meaning, the movements were already ingrained. Play also taught cooperation. Mock hunts demanded teamwork. Children formed small bands, strategizing without words, gesturing, signaling. They learned when to move together and when to split, how to corner an opponent, how to feint and mislead. These weren't just games, they were practice runs for group hunts, scaled down but no less instructive. And, inevitably, there were injuries. Stone chips, cut fingers, sticks, smacked eyes, falls broke bones. Archaeological evidence from child skeletons shows healed fractures, crooked arms, and scarred bone signatures of a childhood where training carried risk. But pain wasn't a deterrent, it was part of the lesson. Every bruise, every scrape, every scar was a mark of progress. Yet, within all the danger and discipline, there was joy. Prehistoric play was laughter threaded with survival. The games carried real stakes, but they also bound children together, forming alliances, rivalries, and trust that would matter in adult hunts. Childhood camaraderie wasn't trivial, it was the glue that turned individuals into hunting teams. So when children wrestled in the dust, threw stones until their arms ached, or stalked each other with mock seriousness, they weren't wasting time. They were rehearsing the kill, practicing the pursuit, embedding hunting into muscle and memory. Words would come later. For now, the body learned in silence, through games that blurred into training. And when the games grew too complex for imitation alone, the body needed something else. A system of signals and gestures, silent codes that bound the group together without language. Before words stitched thoughts together, the hunt was choreographed through glances, nods, and the subtle flick of a hand. Gesture was the first classroom of communication, and for children learning to hunt, it mattered more than vocabulary. Silence wasn't optional. Prey spooked easily, predators listened closely, and noise carried far in open landscapes. So hunting instruction had to be quiet, and children learned an entire system of signals long before their mouths could keep pace. Pointing, for instance, wasn't just look there. It carried layers. Track here, danger ahead, follow me. A raised hand could mean stop instantly, while a finger pressed to lips wasn't an invitation to behave politely, but a warning that one careless sound might cost the group its dinner. Even infants absorbed these cues, their eyes tracking the sweep of an arm, their bodies freezing when the adults froze. Anthropologists note that hunter-gatherer children today pick up gestural codes early, long before mastering full speech. They don't need an explanation of predator when they see adults widen their eyes or stiffen suddenly. They don't need the word hunt when older siblings crouch and beckon silently toward rustling grass. Communication was embodied, not spoken. Children mirrored gestures clumsily at first. They pointed in the wrong direction, froze too late, or misread a cue and scared off game. Mistakes were met with exasperated looks, sharp hand signals, or, if the animal was lost, the unspoken blame of hungry bellies. Words weren't necessary to teach the lesson, shame and repetition did the work. Over time, the gestures became fluent. A tilt of the head, a quick glance, a subtle wave of fingers all carried meaning. Children rehearsed them in play, stalking each other with mock signals, turning games into silent dramas of pursuit and escape. What looked like pantomime was actually preparation, embedding coordination that speech hadn't yet refined. And gestures weren't limited to the hunt. They extended to camp life. A mother might signal a child to hush when predators prowled nearby, or beckon them closer without uttering a sound. A father might mime the shape of antlers while retelling a hunt by firelight, passing knowledge without syllables. These silent cues wove children into the group's rhythm, shaping their instincts before their tongues shaped words. The use of gesture even left its mark on art. Rock paintings and carvings show figures with arms raised, weapons angled, bodies frozen mid-signal. Some researchers argue these are not just depictions of animals, but of the choreography of hunting itself. Children, watching these marks by firelight, absorbed the codes visually as well as physically. Gesture wasn't simply a stopgap until language developed. It was a system in its own right, efficient and immediate. For children, it was the first literacy, reading the body, not the word. And by the time speech caught up, they already had years of silent fluency. But gestures alone weren't enough. To hunt well, children needed to sharpen senses as finely as flint blades, eyes trained to read tracks, ears tuned to the faintest rustle, noses alert to the smell of fresh blood. Language could wait. Their education continued through the body's raw instruments. For a prehistoric child, education didn't begin with alphabets or numbers. It began with the training of the senses. Eyes, ears, skin, and nose were the curriculum. Words were secondary. A child who couldn't see the faint trace of hoofprints in the soil or hear the sudden silence of birds had already failed the first test of survival. Sight was drilled in every step. Children learned to read landscapes as if they were books. Only the letters were broken twigs, disturbed dust, or a single bent blade of grass. Tracks weren't obvious, sometimes just a shallow dent, sometimes only the faint impression of toes in mud, half-dried by the sun. Adults didn't explain it with lectures. They simply crouched, touched the earth, and expected the child to notice. Missing it meant losing the trail, and losing the trail meant hunger. Hearing was honed in silence. Children were taught to stop, to listen not to words but to the soundscape of the wild. The sudden absence of birdsong was a signal as clear as a shouted warning. Something was moving, predator or prey. The rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig, the distant snort of an animal all demanded instant recognition. Those who grew up in constant chatter today would have failed miserably. Too much noise makes you deaf to what matters. Smell, too, was sharpened. Blood on the wind told of a fresh kill, whether made by kin or rival predator. The musky scent of an animal lingered in thickets or near watering holes. Children followed their parents' noses before they had words for those scents. They learned to wrinkle their faces when danger smelled near decay, predator musk, fire on the wrong side of the horizon. Even touch had its lessons. Fingers learned to feel the difference between fresh tracks and old ones, moist earth versus dried crust. Bare feet told whether ground was safe to tread or whether it would betray movement with a crunch. A child's skin was their first instrument, registering cold, heat, vibration, the tremors of hoofbeats running through the soil long before eyes confirmed it. Anthropologists note that hunter-gatherer children today often outperform adults from industrial societies in sensory tests. They can identify dozens of bird calls by ear, distinguish edible from poisonous plants by smell, and track subtle ground changes invisible to outsiders. It isn't magic, it's training that begins before speech, when the body is forced to notice because words aren't there to fill the gaps. This sensory education wasn't separate from play or imitation. It was woven into everything. Children practiced spotting hidden animals during games, listening for cues from siblings, sniffing the air as they trailed behind adults. It was less lesson time than constant rehearsal, a daily sharpening of perception, and it was unforgiving. Miss a track, and the group went hungry. Fail to hear, and you stumbled into danger. Ignore a smell, and you walked into the path of predators. Sensory training wasn't romantic, it was relentless. Children who didn't master it quickly bore the scars of mistakes, if they survived at all. Yet once sharpened, these senses made the world impossibly vivid. The forest wasn't quiet, it was alive with whispers of movement. The plain wasn't empty, it was crisscrossed with trails written in dirt and dung. The air wasn't neutral, it carried news in every shift of scent. To survive, children learned to read this silent script fluently. their senses writing knowledge into their bones long before their tongues could form the words. And when senses had been trained and tested, the next stage in the curriculum was harsher still, danger itself, the teacher that never asked politely but always left marks. In the prehistoric classroom, the most reliable instructor was danger. And unlike the patient elder crouched over tracks or the sibling giggling through mock hunts, danger didn't give feedback gently. It lunged, it bit, it burned, and it left reminders carved into bone. Children learned quickest when survival itself administered the lesson. Evidence is scattered in the archaeology of small skeletons, healed fractures, twisted limbs, cracked skulls that knitted back together in crooked shapes. These aren't the marks of ritual sacrifice or battle there, the signatures of accidents. The curriculum of growing up where cliffs, rivers, and animals all waited for a careless step. A child slipping on wet stone might break an arm. Another, chasing after prey too eagerly, might find teeth buried in a thigh. The bones tell the story. Survival education wasn't theoretical, it was brutal and personal. Play could turn serious in an instant. That stick fight rehearsing spear throws, a mistimed swing could split a lip wide open. That game of chase across a rocky field, one bad tumble could leave scars that lasted a lifetime. For modern parents worried about playground scrapes, the prehistoric childhood would have been unthinkably an endless obstacle course, with consequences measured in disfigurement or death. But danger didn't only arrive through accidents. Predators were teachers too, though their lessons were particularly harsh. Children had to learn, quickly, what lion tracks looked like, what the cough of a leopard meant, how silence in the bush was not peace but threat. Sometimes they learned by watching an older hunter drive off an animal. Sometimes they learned because the beast came too close, and running was the only test that mattered. Either way, the memory embedded itself deeper than any spoken warning could. Even food could be perilous. Mistaking a poisonous plant for an edible one, or drinking from the wrong water source, taught lessons with stomach cramps, convulsions, or worse. Here again the evidence lingers, traces of toxins found in ancient remains, the telltale signs of accidental ingestion. Trial and error wasn't abstracted, was embodied, suffered, endured. Children bore these risks not in isolation but under the wary eyes of adults who knew they couldn't shield them forever. Anthropologists studying modern foraging societies find the same balance. Children are given freedom to explore, but not immunity from risk. A scraped knee is tolerated, a broken arm lamented but expected. Danger is woven into the pedagogy, and pain becomes a form of memory, ensuring mistakes are not repeated. This kind of education produces resilience, not as a choice but as a necessity. The body toughens, reflexes sharpen, fear itself becomes a skill, calibrated by experience. Children grow into adults who move carefully not because someone lectured them about safety, but because scars whisper their reminders every time they lift a spear or crouch at a watering hole. And while danger was always present, it rarely killed outright, at least not most of the time. It wounded, scarred, and reshaped. In this way, danger wasn't just a threat but a sculptor, chiseling survival into every child's body. By the time they reached adolescence, many carried a gallery of reminders etched into their bones, living proof that knowledge had been earned through blood. Yet children didn't walk that path alone. If danger was the sculptor, the community was the frame, shaping and guiding without words, ensuring each child's bruises and scars built toward competence rather than chaos. No prehistoric child was raised by parents alone. Instruction in hunting and survival more broadly was communal, parceled out among a shifting cast of siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts, and elders who shared responsibility without ever drawing up lesson plans. In small foraging bands, every adult was both teacher and examiner, and every mistake was corrected not with words but with a well-placed look, a gesture, or, when necessary, the collective disappointment of an entire camp that had just lost its supper. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies today note that children wander freely among households, absorbing skills from whomever they happen to be near. The same was almost certainly true in the deep past. A toddler might learn how to balance a stick spear from an older sibling. An adolescent might practice sharpening stone flakes with an uncle. A grandmother, her days of long-distance hunting over, might still point out edible roots or mimic the call of a bird to guide the young. Knowledge wasn't centralized. It was scattered, diffused, and constantly reinforced. Communal instruction also meant communal tolerance. A child wasn't scolded for playing with miniature tools or practicing mock hunts. They were encouraged. Archaeological finds of small-sized bows and spears suggest that adults not only tolerated this behavior, but actively provided the equipment. The camp was effectively a training ground, where everyone understood that play blurred into practice, and practice blurred into survival. There was no single teacher-child relationship, no tidy nuclear household with structured lessons. Instead, the whole group invested in a child's competence, because competence secured the group's survival. If a child failed to learn, the failure wasn't theirs alone. It meant more mouths unprepared to feed themselves, more risks carried by others, more strain on the band. The child's body was their own, but their skills were everyone's business. Even discipline was collective. A poorly timed shout that scared off game didn't earn a lecture so much as a chorus of groans and sharp gestures from everyone nearby. The correction was swift, public, and unforgettable. In the same way, successes were communal property. A child's first rabbit or fish was rarely eaten by the hunter alone. It was shared, turning individual achievement into collective pride. This collective shaping created something unusual by modern standards. Children weren't instructed as separate individuals. They were folded seamlessly into group identity. The lesson wasn't just how to throw a spear or track an animal, but how to be a functioning node in the network of survival. To move when the group moved, to hush when the group hushed, to share when the group shared. And all of this happened in silence more often than speech, because words were still being pieced together, and because silence in the hunt was more eloquent than any sentence. The community didn't teach by design, but by immersion. Simply existing in the web of daily life was an apprenticeship. A child who lingered by the fire watching adults carve tools was learning. A child who trailed behind older siblings during foraging trips was learning. A child who sat still while hunters mimed the day's chase was learning. No one announced it, no one labeled it. The teaching was everywhere, and the teachers were everyone. But communal instruction didn't stop at the pragmatic. It spilled into the symbolic, weaving skill with ritual, gesture with meaning, so that every hunt carried echoes of something larger than the immediate kill. For a child learning to hunt, the education wasn't just about practical skills. It was wrapped in layers of ritual and symbol. Prehistoric life didn't draw neat lines between the useful and the sacred. The act of throwing a spear, skinning an animal, or even watching the sky was often accompanied by gestures, songs, or painted marks that infused survival with meaning far beyond calories and hides. Archaeological traces point to this fusion. Cave paintings aren't just pretty pictures of animals. Many scholars argue they were part of a symbolic system tied to hunting itself. The images of bison, deer, or mammoths on stone walls may have been more than decoration. They were visual rehearsals, ritual performances painted into permanence. A child, sitting by flickering firelight in a cave, wasn't merely looking at art. They were absorbing an entire cosmology. This is the animal, this is the chase, this is how we remember and ensure the hunt. Children weren't excluded from these rituals. Far from it, they were often placed directly in their midst. Small handprints on cave walls, some belonging to children as young as 5, suggest that they were not only present, but participating. To press a hand against stone and leave a mark in ochre was, in effect, to claim membership in the hunting world, before one had the strength to carry a spear. Ritual could also appear in the hunt itself. Before setting out, hunters might paint their bodies, sing quietly, or enact a short performance mimicking the prey. Children, watching this, learned not just technique but the idea that the hunt was a dialogue with forces beyond human control. Prey wasn't just meat, it was a being negotiated with, respected, sometimes feared. Symbols carved into bone or antler may have been teaching tools as well. Lines, scratches, and notches could have marked hunting tallies, lunar cycles, or ritual events tied to animal migrations. A child, turning such an object over in their small hands, was learning a coded story: when to hunt, what to expect, what patterns mattered. The tool wasn't only a tool, it was also a mnemonic device, binding memory to material. Even the kill itself carried ritual weight. In some sites, animal skulls appear arranged deliberately, as though children and adults alike were meant to see not just a carcass but a reminder of the cycle they lived within. The hunt was brutal, yes, but it was also framed in symbolism. ensuring children understood it wasn't a reckless act of violence, but part of a system that demanded both reverence and skill. This layering of ritual didn't dilute the practical lessons, it deepened them. To mimic an animal's movement in a ritual dance was also to learn its gait, its speed, its weakness. To paint it on stone was to memorize its shape in detail. To handle a carved bone with scratches was to hold data, calendar, and story in one. Symbol was memory encoded in form. For children, these rituals stitched their learning into something larger than themselves. They weren't just training to survive. They were inheriting a worldview in which every gesture, every animal, every mark on stone carried weight. And once ritual wrapped itself around daily practice, it ensured children wouldn't forget the lesson was too heavy, too sacred, too thoroughly embedded to slip away. And yet, for all its ritual weight, hunting was never just a symbolic performance. It was also a grim arithmetic, calories in versus calories out, hunger against abundance. Which meant that children weren't just learning reverence, they were learning the economy of survival. For all the ritual and symbolism painted on cave walls, the bottom line of a prehistoric childhood was simple: eat or don't. Hunger was the background music of existence, drumming in the stomachs of adults and children alike. And because food scarcity was routine, children's lessons in hunting weren't cushioned by choice. They learned quickly that missing a rabbit wasn't just disappointing, it meant another day gnawing roots, or going to sleep with nothing. Anthropological studies of modern foraging peoples show that children often spend long stretches hungry, and prehistoric childhood was no kinder. Archaeological evidence of growth stunting and enamel, hypoplasia lines on teeth, formed during malnutrition confirms that food shortages were common. Kids didn't need lectures on the importance of hunting success. Their bones carried the reminders. Hunger itself was the tutor, relentless and persuasive. Small kills were often the training ground. Children's early prey lizards, birds, fish, rabbits, weren't glamorous, but they filled bellies. A first successful strike wasn't celebrated with a trophy photo. It was devoured before the meat even cooled. The reward was visceral, a scrap of protein, the greasy feel of fat on the tongue, the immediate relief of not being empty. Success didn't need applause. The stomach did all the cheering. And failure wasn't abstract either. A missed throw, a spooked animal, an arrow that glanced instead of struck had consequences. The body reminded you by staying weak, tired, slower on the next attempt. Even the smallest mistake fed into the cycle of scarcity, making every hunt feel heavier than its size. Children didn't need to be told why hunting mattered. Their hunger explained it better than words ever could. Sharing added another layer. In most foraging groups, a child's catch was distributed, at least partly, among the community. That meant one child's skill could lighten the hunger of many. And it meant the flip side too. Failure wasn't just your empty stomach, but a missed chance for the group. Hunger created responsibility long before adulthood. To succeed was to be praised. To fail was to let others tighten their belts another notch. This kind of economy shaped children into pragmatists early. They learned that not all prey was worth the effort. Some animals, too fast or too big, cost more calories than they gave back. Children weren't hunting for fun, they were doing survival math without numbers, guided by the hard accounting of hunger. And when the math worked out, when the calories from a kill outweighed the energy burned in chasing it, the satisfaction wasn't symbolic. It was a warm belly, a fuller camp, and a brief moment of relief from the grind of scarcity. The memory of that balanced hunger answered by reward stuck deeper than any carved mark on bone. It trained children to weigh effort against gain, to know instinctively when to risk, when to wait, when to save their strength. Hunger was the great motivator, sharper than ritual, harsher than discipline, impossible to ignore. But even relief was temporary. A single kill didn't guarantee tomorrow's meal. The cycle reset with each dawn, and children had to face it again. Which is why, as they grew, training sharpened, not just toward feeding themselves, but toward preparing for the unforgiving threshold of adolescence, the moment when mistakes could no longer be forgiven as childish. Childhood in prehistory had no neat ending marked by birthdays or school certificates. The transition to adolescence was measured in blood, muscle, and expectation. Somewhere between the first awkward kills and the first visible signs of maturity, the community shifted its gaze. The same clumsy child tolerated for missing a rabbit was now expected to stand shoulder to shoulder with seasoned hunters, and there was no gentle adjustment period. The stakes rose overnight. Archaeological evidence makes this visible in bones. As soon as children's skeletons reached a certain robustness, they carried heavier workloads. Stress markers on adolescent bones show repetitive strain from long hunts, heavy carrying, or endless tool-making. Teeth reveal more wear, evidence of chewing tough hides and sinew. Their bodies were not spared, they were drafted. Anthropology of recent forager groups shows the same shift. Boys expected to join men on hunts. Girls expected to gather as adults, both held to higher standards of contribution. Adolescence wasn't a waiting room, it was an abrupt promotion. And that promotion came with scrutiny. Where play once excused mistakes, failure now carried weight. Lose your nerve at the wrong moment, and the group might go hungry. Panic at the sight of blood, and your reputation could sour before it even formed. Ritual often marked this shift. Some societies passed and presented ceremonies to underline the transition, with scarification, tooth removal, or seclusion. These weren't empty gestures. They made sure the entire community understood. This one is no longer a child. Pain served as punctuation, branding the moment of change directly into flesh. Archaeological finds of modified teeth, pierced bones, and scarred remains confirm that these practices reach back into deep time. Adolescence wasn't just biology, it was inscribed socially and physically. Training intensified, too. Adolescents were pushed into more dangerous hunts, longer forays, harsher tests, where younger children might stalk rabbits. Adolescents learned persistence, hunting running animals to exhaustion, or joined the pursuit of large prey, where risk of trampling or goring was constant. Their bodies became experiments in endurance, and the line between training and trial blurred until it disappeared. Socially, adolescence carried weight as well. Peer groups mattered. The clumsy, unprepared adolescent could become an object of ridicule, while the skilled one gained prestige. In bands where reputation influenced mating and survival, adolescence was the proving ground, not just for hunting, but for identity. To succeed was to step into a role that secured both respect and potential partners. To fail was to slide into the margins of the group, tolerated but diminished. For girls, the transition was equally stark. Biological changes came with new expectations, often tied to reproduction and the demands of gathering. Their survival training emphasized plant knowledge, food preparation, and sometimes even participation in hunts or butchering. Adolescent girls, too, bore the physical record of their work: spinal strain from carrying loads, cuts from tools, wear on teeth from processing fibers or hides. Their roles were no less demanding, only differently calibrated. In every case, adolescence was not a gentle bridge, but a cliff edge. One day you were a child tolerated in error. The next, you were an almost adult required to perform. Ritual, hunger, community, and danger all converged to drive the point home. There was no more rehearsal, no more pretending. Survival now counted on your contribution. And beyond this point, the story of childhood dissolved entirely into the responsibilities of adulthood. The scars on bones, the marks on teeth, the stories etched into cave walls, they all fold into the larger tale of human survival. Childhood ends, not with celebration, but with absorption into the ceaseless rhythm of the hunt.